Now, there were foreign influences on American conservatism. One of the most important was Edmund Burke, who was Irish and British, and perhaps the most important conservative thinker of the 18th century. He placed a high value on order, stability, and moderation in foreign relations. But most notably, he opposed the British government's attempts to crush the American Revolution. At the same time, he also understood that the French Revolution was different. It was not based on the same values and goals. He opposed the French Revolution, and he urged the use of force against it. In his 1790 book, Reflections on the Revolution in France, Burke predicted that the French Revolution would end disastrously. Exactly 3 years later, what is known as the Revolutionary Terror, or the Reign of Terror, would begin with the purge of anti-revolutionary enemies of the people. America's revolutionaries upheld individual rights and freedoms, which necessarily implied limits on the power of the government. The French, by contrast, insisted on what we now call entitlements. Burke objected to this. As he put it, what is the use of discussing a man's abstract right to food or to medicine? The question is upon the method of procuring and administering them. In this deliberation, I shall always advise to call in the aid of the farmer and the physician rather than the professor. We Americans fought 3 other foreign wars in the 19th century: the War of 1812, which lasted until 1815, a war with Mexico from 1846 to 1848, and the Spanish-American War in 1898. And that last war was only 10 weeks long, but it ended with the acquisition of Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and the annexation of Hawaii. The 20th century brought the First World War. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson defeated the Republican presidential nominee, Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes. Wilson pledged to keep the United States out of the war in Europe, but we were drawn in anyway. And afterwards, many conservatives were reluctant to take sides in European conflicts. The bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, followed by Germany's declaration of war on America, changed attitudes quickly. The nation united to fight against the Nazis and other fascist powers. The first Republican president after World War II was Dwight David Eisenhower, who during World War II had been supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe. But the years of his presidency, 1953 and 1961, were not growth years for the conservative movement. Liberalism was ascendant. One response. In 1955, William F. Buckley Jr. launched National Review. Its purpose, Buckley wrote, was to stand athwart history yelling stop at a time when no one is inclined to do so or to have much patience with those who so urge it. Among the conservative convictions, to use his word, that Buckley expressed, the century's most blatant force of satanic utopianism is communism. We consider coexistence with communism neither desirable, nor possible, nor honorable. We find ourselves irrevocably at war with communism and shall oppose any substitute for victory. Also this, no superstition has more effectively bewitched America's liberal elite than the fashionable concepts of world government, the United Nations, internationalism, international atomic pools, etc. Perhaps the most important and readily demonstrable lesson of history is that freedom goes hand in hand with a state of political decentralization, that remote government is irresponsible government. It would make greater sense, Buckley said, to grant independence to each of our 50 states than to surrender U.S. sovereignty to a world organization. In the fall of 1960, some 90 young conservatives met at Buckley's Sharon, Connecticut home, where they founded Young Americans for Freedom. To articulate their principles, the group adopted the Sharon Statement, which was drafted by a very bright 26-year-old newspaper editor, M. Stanton Evans. Written, quote, at this time of moral and political crisis, the statement is a succinct summary of the central ideas of modern American conservatism. It affirmed certain eternal truths and set out the most important ideas that we as young conservatives believe. As for foreign policy, it stated that we will be free only so long as the national sovereignty of the United States is secure, that history shows periods of freedom are rare and can exist only when free citizens concertedly defend their rights against all enemies, that the forces of international communism are at present the greatest single threat to these liberties, that the United States should stress victory over rather than coexistence with this menace, and that American foreign policy must be judged by this criterion: does it serve the just interests of the United States? A few years later, there was a bitter struggle within the Republican Party between conservatives and what might be called Eastern moderates. The YAF, Young Americans for Freedom, played an important role, giving its support to Senator Barry M. Goldwater, who in 1964 won both the presidential nomination and control of the Republican Party. Goldwater was adamantly anti-communist. He saw clearly the danger that communist regimes, movements, and ideology pose to free peoples and those that hope to be. And he favored pursuing victory in Vietnam. Lyndon Baines Johnson used all that against Goldwater, branding him as a dangerous warmonger who was also mentally unfit and who might well provoke a nuclear exchange should voters be foolish enough to send him to the White House. Johnson won a landslide victory, and despite his anti-war rhetoric, continued and even deepened American involvement in Vietnam, though with little effect. The war became increasingly unpopular, and many came to the conclusion that it was unwinnable. 4 years later, Johnson decided against running for re-election. Republican Richard Nixon, claiming to have a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam, defeated Democrat Hubert Humphrey. Henry Kissinger was recruited first as National Security Advisor, later as Secretary of State. He was the dominant foreign policy figure from about 1969 to 1977. Kissinger was a proponent of realpolitik, which implies a foreign policy based on power and interests more than values and principles. Kissinger's approach was meant to be practical, examples being détente with the Soviet Union and the opening of relations with Communist China. Eventually, Nixon would resign over the Watergate scandal. Gerald Ford would take his place. Ford was followed by Jimmy Carter, whose single term in the White House was marred by one foreign policy disaster after another. Most consequential was the fall of the Shah and the Islamic Revolution that transformed Iran into the first modern nation dedicated to jihad, a holy war against the West, what the Islamists call the Crusader-Zionist alliance. This was not well understood back then. As it happens, I was a young reporter in Iran, and my skepticism about what was taking place there was not shared by most of my colleagues. For example, on February 12, 1979, Time magazine reported there was a sense of controlled optimism in Iran. Iranians will surely insist that revolution live up to its democratic aims. Those who know Khomeini expect that eventually he will settle in the Shiite holy city of Qom and resume a life of teaching and prayer. Khomeini believes that Iran should become a parliamentary democracy with several political parties. A New York Times editorial reassured readers that moderate, progressive individuals were advising Khomeini. The Times predicted the Ayatollah would provide, quote, a desperately needed model of humane governance for a third world country. President Carter's UN ambassador, Andrew Young, called Khomeini some kind of saint. William Sullivan, the U.S. ambassador in Tehran, compared Khomeini to Gandhi. And a State Department spokesman worried about the possibility of a military coup, saying that would be most dangerous for U.S. interests. It would blow away the moderates and invite the majority to unite behind a radical faction.